Today's Democratic Party rejects the rule of law. What does that mean? The people's trust, our trust in the rule of law, is the foundation of our democracy. And by weaponizing the security state and federal law enforcement for their own partisan political ambitions, Democrat leaders are undermining the rule of law and turning our democracy into a banana republic. Now, across the country, we see a lot of examples of this. We see Democrat politicians calling for defunding the police, demonizing the police, and enacting laws that favor criminals' rights over those of everyday Americans. We have so-called progressive DAs, district attorneys, that let violent criminals out of jail, refusing to charge them, even though many have been arrested 30, 40, or even 50 times. So is it any surprise, really, that crime and murder rates are rapidly increasing? That people don't feel safe walking down the street in their own neighborhoods? Don't feel safe allowing their kids to walk to school? Is it any surprise that firearm purchases for self-defense have skyrocketed over the last couple of years? Now, under the Obama administration, the IRS was used to target conservative groups. Now, Biden's Department of Justice recently indicted 11 pro-life activists for organizing an event blockading an abortion clinic. That's what they were charged with. They didn't use physical force. They weren't dangerous. But 7 of those 11, they're facing 11 years in prison and fines of $250,000. I want to say that again. 7 of these pro-life protesters are facing 11 years in prison and fines of $250,000. The Biden Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security have focused their newly formed domestic terror unit to target parents who are vocally standing in opposition to radical curriculums and explicit sexual content being taught to their kids in public schools. The Biden administration is labeling these parents as terrorists just for showing up at school board meetings and demanding change. Now, President Biden campaigned on a message of unity, healing the partisan divide, bringing the country together. But he just gave a big speech saying that supporters of President Trump are the most extremist group in our country and a threat to our democracy. That's half the country. Now you've got Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris. They are proclaiming that the Supreme Court is illegitimate just because they disagree with its rulings. They're undermining the legitimacy of the Supreme Court given their position of power in making these statements. We've got the Biden administration that stood by and did absolutely nothing as activists protested outside the homes of Supreme Court justices during all hours of the day and night in clear violation of federal law. Now go back and look again. How did the Biden administration treat those pro-life, nonviolent protesters? And look at how they treated those who were protesting outside the homes, their families and children of these Supreme Court justices live. When the party in power does not believe in the rule of law, but they're responsible for writing and enforcing laws, our democracy is doomed. Today's Democratic Party does not believe in our constitutionally protected right to free speech. Fostering diversity of thought and freedom of expression is the very foundation of any flourishing democracy. Democratic Party leaders don't agree. They are led by fanatical ideologues who pose a threat to our democracy because they don't believe in freedom. They don't believe in freedom of speech. They don't believe in freedom of thought, freedom of religion. Because of that, they try to censor speech that they don't like, labeling it as, hey, this is misinformation, this is hate speech, this is violent speech. And they are working hand in glove with corporate for-profit media and big tech to smear and silence political opponents and anyone who dares to challenge their authority, their narrative, and therefore exposing their insecurities. Not too long ago, the Biden administration even tried launching their own Ministry of Truth with the objective of controlling what information we are allowed to read, hear, and say. They will determine what is misinformation, what is true, and what is not. Now, their ideology is one of hate and divisiveness rather than respect and love, aloha. And they stand diametrically opposed to traditional liberalism, which recognizes the basic goodness of people and the autonomy of the individual, supporting civil liberties, supporting a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now tell me, how can a political party that is opposed to freedom be trusted with our democracy and our God-given freedoms enshrined in the Constitution? They can't be. Today's Democratic Party does not believe in our constitutionally protected right to freedom of religion. Now, the Constitution recognizes that our freedom comes from God, not the government, not any government. Unfortunately, Democratic Party leaders reject this truth and are hostile toward people of faith and spirituality and actively try to undermine our religious freedom. Now, during the 2020 Democratic National Convention, they chose to omit the words "under God" from our Pledge of Allegiance. We've seen over years how high-profile Democratic leaders openly mock or discriminate against people of faith, especially Christians. And President Obama once ridiculed Americans for clinging to their guns and religion. Vice President Kamala Harris, back when she was a U.S. Senator in 2018, she remarked that being a member of the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic charity organization, a nonprofit, disqualified Brian Boucher from serving as a federal judge. Senator Dianne Feinstein derided now Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who happens to be a devout Catholic, during her Senate confirmation hearing, stating, quote, "The dogma lives loudly within you." Now let's remember the Constitution. Article 6, Section 3 says, and I quote, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States." Now, how is it that the Democratic Party of today doesn't seem to know this? That the Democratic Party of today has forgotten that freedom of religion does not mean freedom from religion. Our government must respect every American's deeply personal relationship with God and our freedom to express that and practice that faith without fear of state-sponsored reprisal or punishment, censorship, or discrimination. Now, whether you believe in God or not isn't the point here. The point is that any political party that is trying to erase the presence of God from every facet of public life and is hostile towards those who choose to worship God cannot be trusted to protect our inalienable God-given rights enshrined in the Constitution, and therefore should not be in power. Today's Democratic Party racializes everything and blatantly foments anti-white racism. The Democratic machine has betrayed Dr. Martin Luther King's dream, his dream of a nation where we are judged based on the content of our character rather than the color of our skin. And in their blind pursuit of power, Democrat leaders have reduced each of us as God's children to the color of our skin, using identity politics to tear us apart, all so they can win a few votes, all so they can gain more political power. Democrats were completely silent in the face of Mayor Lori Lightfoot's blatant racist policy of only accepting interviews with reporters of color because she was struck with the, quote, "overwhelming whiteness and maleness." Modern-day segregation in schools is being promoted by racial profiteers like Robin DiAngelo and the corrupt, self-identified cultural Marxists who lead Black Lives Matter. Where's the Democratic Party of today stand on that? Well, they embrace these people and their ideology and celebrate their racist agenda. They support programs that are teaching our kids in public schools that they are either the privileged or the victims, the oppressors or the oppressed, solely because of the color of their skin. They have become the racists that they claim to hate. Today's Democratic Party is anti-woman. There's no greater expression of hatred and hostility towards women than to erase the existence of women as a category of people. Now, if you've been paying attention, the Democratic Party has always claimed to be the champions for women, to stand proudly for the passage and enactment of Title IX, making history, leveling the playing field for women and girls. But if you listen to them lately and you look at what they're doing, the Biden administration and today's Democratic Party are spitting in the face of these achievements by rejecting the objective truth and reality that women exist and are not just a construct in someone's mind. They can no longer even define what a woman is. And they're demanding that we replace words like mother with birthing person and place women at risk just to please biological men who claim to be women at any given moment. They're taking away opportunities and futures from girls in sports by allowing transgender athletes who until recently identified as men and who clearly have a biological advantage of being a man to compete against women. Now, behind the scenes, behind the curtain, the Biden administration is quietly trying to change Title IX through a backdoor rule change that would actually remove women and biological sex from the Title IX statute. Now, if you remember, Title IX was passed specifically out of a recognition of the difference in the biological sex between men and women. And by recognizing that difference in the biological sex, providing opportunities and fairness and a level playing field for women and girls. The Biden administration's action now to take away women and biological sex from that definition of Title IX is absolutely taking away opportunities for millions of young girls and women across the country. They are even now going so far as to claim that it is sexual harassment to address someone by the wrong pronouns. So when you look at all of their actions, really what they're trying to do is to force us to comply. They're trying to force us to comply with this literal insanity by trying to regulate our speech and thought with the threat of punishment if we don't comply. By denying that there are biological differences between men and women, they're erasing women and denying the existence of objective truth. This is really the bigger issue here. Because if one denies the existence of truth, then there are no boundaries. There are no limits in our society. And really what happens then is the truth becomes whatever those in power want it to be. And that's exactly what we are seeing happen in our society, in this country today. Today's Democratic Party is undermining families. Now, families are the bedrock of civilization. Today's Democratic Party does not recognize this truth and the importance of this central foundational role that families play in our society and civilization. And because they don't recognize this truth, they want to strip away the rights of parents to raise their kids, claiming, hey, we in the government know what's better for you and your children and your family better than you do. Former Democratic governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, said last year, there is no role for parents in determining a school's curriculum. You don't get a say. The largest teachers union in the country and one of the Democratic Party's biggest donors, the National Education Association, recently passed a resolution that endorses the teaching of critical race theory in classrooms across the country. Public school districts are implementing policies that sexualize kids as young as 5 or 6 years old. Taxpayer dollars are being used to bring in drag strippers and encourage gender transition surgery in minors, all kept secret from their parents. Teachers not being allowed to talk to parents about what's going on with their children at school. We have the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Rachel Levine saying young children should be empowered to get gender affirmation treatment, which often involves puberty blockers, chemical castration, and irreversible surgeries that cause long-term harm to kids. Now, here's the thing. If parents don't comply, the federal government threatens to bring in Child Protective Services, get them involved, and take your kids away. Families are the foundation of civilization and our society. And today's Democratic Party's policies are very quickly eroding that foundation to the detriment of us all.